So this is part 15 of my reading and commentary on the dialogue of Parmenides. So I'd like to jump right into where we left off. I'll read the first couple sentences of where we were. Parmenides says, "Is it then both equal and unequal to itself and the others?" "How so?" says Aristotle. "If the one were greater or less than the others, or they in turn greater or less than it, they wouldn't be in any way greater or less than each other, by the one being one and the others being other than one. That is, by their own being, would they? But if they each had equally, in addition to their own being, they would be equal to each other. And if the others had largeness and the one had smallness, or vice versa, whichever form had largeness attached would be the greater, and whichever had smallness attached would be less, necessarily." So, we left off with the following sentence. If the one were greater or less than the others, or they in turn greater or less than it, they wouldn't be in any way greater or less than each other, by the one being one and the others being other than one. Now specifically, we discussed the first part of that sentence. If the one were greater or less than the others, or they in turn greater or less than it. And we came to this understanding of relational relevance, in which it's necessary to consider the context by which we consider that which is large and that which is small. The influence of the one, regardless of its comparative largeness or smallness, has great influence. Its coherence is the foundation for all things. Now, when Parmenides says they wouldn't be in any way greater or less than each other by the one being one and the others being other than one. Now, this is an interesting point to make, because essentially what we're saying here is that within the principle, within the foundational principle, that is within being, and I think you can extend this out and say within the coherence of oneness and being, because if we're going to go by being, we might as well just go by the one's influence in general. By these fundamental principles, there is a seeming symmetry or equivalence there. So I'll read this again. They wouldn't be in any way greater or less than each other, by the one being one and the others being other than one. That is, he says, by their own being. And I think that last bit is the most important part. If we just left it as it was, I'm not sure it would quite make sense. Because we'd still be left in this landscape, this territory for which there are so many different hypotheticals, and these hypotheticals can be satisfied in a number of ways. And so we need some farther indication of where the similarity rests. And if we say it rests in being, well, the fact that it has its principle in being the rooted principle introduces a type of similarity that cannot be differentiated when we speak about otherness or the one. It just sort of is. He continues and he says, but if they each had equality, in addition to their own being, so being itself would be a type of equality, a pure type of equality. But now he's saying in addition to that. So what would be in addition to being? Well, anything that is more than being. So oneness would be one. But I think it's assumed that oneness is along for the ride. So if we are to go beyond that, it would be determinate features. It would be identity. The other possibility is here that Parmenides is experimenting with isolating being and saying, well, is it possible that if the one shares in being just as otherness shares in being, but we don't mention about oneness as the principle, but by the first instance, I think we would be inconsistent. But in the second, it would afford us a greater leeway when talking about otherness, because we don't have to reconcile otherness with oneness. But if they each had equality in addition to their own being, they would be equal to each other. Now, it's an interesting way also to put it, because it would seem that if one shared in being, then that would be the equality, unless being as a purity, it precedes the description of it just precedes the description or the determinate feature of being equal, because it's not differentiated. And if the others had largeness, and the one had smallness, or vice versa, whichever form had largeness attached would be greater, and whichever had smallness attached would be less. So the additional features here are interesting. We're not being too precise, I think. We're trying to play with determinate features and say, well, within the determinate landscape, it matters where we place these determinations, because where the determinations are will determine the relative relationship, or the relationship. Relative relationship is almost redundant. Now, I don't mean to confuse with that prior language. It's just sifting through certain thoughts. If there's no continuity from previous episodes, I think following this might be kind of difficult, but suffice it to say for now, We are operating under a certain rule book by which the one is our foundational identity. It coheres oneness and being together, oneness and being two principles that are sort of near the base or the foundation of reality. And these principles necessarily interact. They don't exist as two separate identities without the coherence of them together. They exist as separate things because we can identify them as such, and we understand that difference has its action there. But anything that is to be instantiated must be because of the coherence between these two principles. Now Parmenides continues and he says, "Then aren't there these two forms, largeness and smallness? For certainly, if there weren't, they couldn't be opposite to each other, and couldn't occur in things that are." So focusing on the first, there aren't these two forms. Now it's interesting, we're coming back full circle. I haven't seen the term forms in this dialogue in a while. We've taken so many different tributaries, and we've been focusing on principles and all of this sort of thing. That form has sort of escaped our grammar. But now that it comes back, the images that we've produced, I think, lead us in a more positive direction in terms of the definition of this term, the form. And as I think about form as it relates to a definition that is similar to shape, the images, as I've mentioned, provide us with that shape. What comes to be the form of something is shaped in this sort of linear progression from the fundamental to something that is increasingly particular and unique, different from something else. And we start with what I call determinate features rather than descriptive features. And these determinate features I've been calling as very basic, like the largeness and smallness, which is mentioned here. This, not that, or this and that, inside, outside. Now, if we are to say that the form exists when the identity is created, then we would say, or at least what we've been saying so far, is that the identity is created when we have determinate features associated with the coherence of oneness and being. And so if we have this and that in terms of a determination, then perhaps from that we have large and small. Then we see that there's a shape happening here. There's a form that's occurring. For certainly, he says, if there weren't, they couldn't be opposite to each other and couldn't occur in things that are. And I think this is a fundamental statement, at least the last part of that, because there is a recognition that the terms themselves, although broad, if we were to say that these terms did not participate in things that are, it would precede being. And if it preceded being, then it wouldn't be determinate. If it's not determinate, if there's no influence of difference, then there is nothing. There is no form that can be ascertained. But there's more here. For certainly, he says, if there weren't, they couldn't be opposite to each other. Now, these opposites I sort of prefer to think about largeness and smallness, not in terms of opposite, but in terms of difference, in terms of separation. I suppose opposite will have its time to be relevant. But for now, when I think of largeness and smallness, I think about the fact that they are different, regardless of the degree of difference. They cause a separation. And actually, what is interesting to me is those types of difference that are so proximate, that it's hard to tell the difference between the two. Because in that situation, we have an identity that is so like another that the mind is forced to reconcile with the subtlety of difference and also the maintenance of identity, as it relates to other things. But nonetheless, largeness and smallness is sort of an obvious example by which we can explore the absolute separation between the two. Now, Aristotle responds to this and he says, no, how could they? Parmenides continues, so if smallness occurs in the one, it would be either in the whole of it or in part of it, necessarily, says Aristotle. So let's think for a moment about what it would mean to have smallness occurring in the one. Do we think about smallness in terms of its relationship to another? I think we would. So the question is, under what circumstance would we consider the one to be smaller than something else? We talked about this, if not earlier in this segment, in the last episode, that by virtue of perspective, if we are considering something that moves away from the base and becomes more determinate and even descriptive, that what we have is more information caked onto something more fundamental. And by this, we would have something larger, potentially. But my mind finds it easy to get lost here, in absence of a definite circumstance by which the one is surely smaller, or has this smallness. Maybe we can ask the question in a different way. Does the one, or how could the one have smallness within it? Is it possible? I think so, because if we take one of its parts, then we would say that in relation to the whole, there is something that is less, something that is smaller. And so since it contains this determinate feature, perhaps by its containment, there is the potential by which it would be smaller than something else. And the example of that I think we've already given. Does this work? I'm not sure. We have to keep going. So if smallness occurs in the one, it would be either in the whole of it or in the part of it, necessarily. What if it were to occur in the whole? Now this is the question that we haven't answered yet. What if it were to occur in the whole? It's hard in some sense to conceptualize this one relative to the part. The part is so much easier. I suppose we can see it when we try to consider the one as an independent identity that is separate from the influence of the one, because the influence is so much larger than, at least it seems like it's so much larger because it gives birth to so much information that the one itself as this sort of conceptual identity is almost reduced in comparison to the influence. So again, the question is, what if it were to occur in the whole? Well, if it were to occur in the whole, that means we would have to see it perspectively in that way. So as a matter of perspective, if the one is less, then it gives us a certain way of relating to the one. So when I think about the one being less in my mind, I think about again, the one is a concept. The one is an identity. The one is an identity that has less of a spatial area, let's say in this hypothetical realm, than that of the expression of it. And here I think about a small person with a loud voice. I think about the number of ways in which we can say that we are larger than ourselves. Like, let's say, my body of work, or let's just take a particular segment that I may have done. It's more than I can do in a day. It's more than I can do in an hour. And so there's moreness that's independent of me. My creative output creates a largeness that transcends me. More than I can do at any one given point, a moment. And I'm hoping that this is a good analogy. What if it were to occur in the whole? Wouldn't it be in the one either by being stretched equally throughout the whole of it, or by containing it? So again, the matter of perspective. If it's stretched throughout, then it's more of how we initially decided to answer it, as on the level of the whole. But if it's inside of it, then it's not necessarily on the level of the whole as the identity. It's on the level of a part. Now, Aristotle responds to this, he says quite clearly. Parmenides continues, wouldn't smallness then, if it were in the one equally throughout, be equal to it. But if it contained the one, be larger. And to that Aristotle says, doubtless. So I want to pause for a moment and think about something that has occurred to me. He says, what if it were to occur in the whole? Wouldn't it be in the one either by stretching equally throughout the whole of it, or by containing it? And I think I glossed over this too quickly, and perhaps I even attributed to the container as a part. But there's a distinction. I think the distinction is obvious, as he leads by saying, what if it were to occur in the whole rather than occurring in the part? Because we had just addressed the part. Now, or by containing it. I do think it's reasonable to suggest that within this container we have a part. It just seems natural for that language to assume a part of something. But then we would run into the issue of it not being in the whole. And so how can we think of the whole as a container without that smallness or largeness being considered a part within the container? It's almost like a gas that fills a space. And while on one level the gas is not completely uniform, I suppose, but it's much more spread out than, let's say, putting a marble in a shoebox. The air and the molecules that are within the concentration of air, whatever it happens to be, oxygen, carbon dioxide, whatever else, this mixture is not going to be as concentrated in one section as the marble in the shoebox. Now, I bring this up, although an imperfect analogy. I think it gives us an idea of what we might consider when we give a determinate term its home within the whole. And I think I still have some difficulty differentiating the two. Between the stretching equally throughout the whole, or by containing. On one hand, we can also draw a parallel to stretching throughout and containing as sort of an equivalent, but he's not using it as an equivalent, so of course he means something different. Perhaps it's not necessary to spend this much time on this part, but nonetheless it's an interesting problem. Now, there's another sense in which we can think about the definition of the word container rather than a volumetric box. We can think of containing as sort of like a subjection or a belonging. And so if this, by this belonging, I think what we have maybe is a more sophisticated relationship between determinate terms and the relationship of the identity that is determined and its relationship to the other. And this largeness and smallness would be relevant here because it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of the two identities that are in question, or perhaps of multiple identities that are being compared to the one. He says, wouldn't smallness then, if it were in the one equally throughout, be equal to it? But if it contained the one, be larger? So let's start with the first assertion. Wouldn't smallness, if it were in the one equally throughout, be equal to it? It's a difficult thing to think about. For we have a determinate term. We have to ask ourselves the question. I think we've gone over this before, but it comes up anew. So, within anything, within any identity that I see in front of me, I can identify parts that are smaller and parts that are larger. I can identify the largeness and smallness in relation to other things, but also in terms of its intra-relationship. So if I look at the lamp, for example, I can consider it's a wooden lamp and it has some wooden carved leaves into the lamp. And I can imagine that one single leaf is smaller than the branch of leaves that extend outward. And perhaps there are individual leaves that are larger or smaller. Undoubtedly they are, even if it's not immediately perceivable. And so this sort of largeness and smallness wouldn't really help us if we're considering a determinate being stretched throughout, because it's more, if we're comparing objects, it's not really about the parts of the thing that we're concerned with, the largeness and smallness therein. It is the largeness and smallness of the identity compared to something else. So the lamp has the largeness relative to the books that are next to it. Wouldn't smallness then, if it were in one equally throughout, be equal to it? But if it contained the one, be larger? So if smallness contained the one, so again, containing the one, we have this sort of relationship of subjection with the volumetric example. We have the holding and the grasping. And if the one is to be sort of interior to, or control I don't want to use, housed perhaps, I want to get away from the analogy of parts. But nonetheless, I think we understand what this means. The identity of largeness or the identity of smallness would be larger than the thing that it contains, necessarily. So I suppose it's sort of an argument of parts. So can smallness be equal or larger than something? Can smallness be equal to or larger than something? So now we're talking about not necessarily a determinant of an identity, we're talking about the identity of smallness itself. So can smallness be equal to or larger than something? So I wonder what can be said about this. Smallness, it would seem, is a term at least smaller is a term that requires comparison. Smallness, I think, requires a certain degree of otherness, such that if all there was smallness, it wouldn't make any sense. Because then it would be hard to differentiate things that are smaller than things that are larger. Now, again, the perspective is a massive assist when it comes to understanding what something is, if something is considered to be small or if it's considered to be large. So, for example, a mouse is almost universally, from the human perspective, seen to be small. But there are plenty of things that the mouse is larger than. Does it mean that the smallness of the mouse is eroded because of the fact that it's larger than some things? No. Because even if we kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller, on one hand, I have to wonder, when we open back up our ontological framework, and we move it into the territory of identity pre-description, we have these terms like the smallness and largeness, the inside, outside, that, this, not that, or that, this and that. And in this landscape, we can assume, or at least it's possible, to arrive here from some sort of deduction in which we took some material object and we reduced it so far that we removed the descriptive qualities. And when we've done that, we have found ourselves in the determinate landscape. And the determinate landscape is very base relation. And what is large and what is small is not necessarily determined by its physical size, nor its properties, but rather its relation to other things. And I suppose we can say that by its relation to other things, given its properties and the like, that it could be considered large or small in the descriptive landscape as well. And I'll take that argument. But there's something altogether fundamentally different when we're in the determinate landscape. And we have sort of these primordial identities that are being formed, that are being shaped, that participate with otherness, that participate with the center, that participate with the periphery, the center of attention or purpose. It's easiest to see it through the lens of purpose or attention. But again, I refer back to that analogy that we went through about this and that. What makes something this and what makes something that? Well, this is the thing, perhaps, of focus, of attention, of concern, of importance, of movement, of whatever. We could think of it a little bit more zoomed out and say that there really is no preference, this or that. We could just as equally say that that is something by which we attend to, and that there's not much attention by way of meaning or purpose in this field at all. But I have to wonder about that. I'm going to put a stopper there and get back to the conversation of smallness. In some sense, I'm not sure it would make sense to ask the question, is something larger than smallness? Because smallness is something that is manifest in our landscape, in identity landscape. There has to be something, well, as soon as I say that, I go back to the thought of smallness being an identity. And we have to remember that parts can be considered as identities. And we have to remember also that at the fundamental place, we have the one. We have the expression of the coherence of oneness in being. And it is by this that we have all other things. Smallness would be a thing, and it would be something of this character. And so it would contain oneness, it would contain being. In its definition, sort of much like non-being or difference or otherness, I think would lie in the relation. It's a term of relation. An identity, sure, but a term of relation. And its expression, much like the coherence of oneness in being, the expression of the one, the expression of smallness occurs in the in-between, in the relations among things. This and that, inside, outside, center, periphery. So can smallness be equal to or larger than something? And I would be apt to say no. And the reason is because it seems like we have two types of determinate families, let's say. The first type is a structural determination. Its behavior carves the field of identity. And then we have a comparative determination, which is what we've been talking about. And these measure relations within that field. So largeness and smallness would be one of those. And so if we were to say that smallness is larger than something else, that wouldn't really make sense, because these determinations are the things that determine. There's not really something that determines well, I want to say that there's not something that determines smallness per se. Now, why is that problematic? Because it's still indeterminate landscape. There are still determinate descriptions, or rather words, determinate words, we can use to give an idea of that geometry. However, the specific determination belongs to that identity. And because of that, its expression is the thing that gives us the smallness and largeness. So to ask the question, is smallness as an identity larger or smaller than something, it doesn't really make sense, because its role is comparative. We can say that comparison happens after orientation exists. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So today is a Wednesday evening. It's a day after a strong rainstorm, and the temperature has been fluctuating. We're nearing the end of winter, and we've had this strange heat wave almost up to 70 degrees, and then it dipped back down again to 36 at the moment. So Parmenides says, so smallness can be equal to or larger than something, and do the jobs of largeness and equality, but not its own. And to that Aristotle says it can't. So smallness could not be in the one as a whole, but if in fact it is in the one, it would be in a part. Yes, says Aristotle. So we begin this exercise anew, thinking about smallness, not just small or smaller, but smallness. We've established a few facts that smallness is itself an identity. But it's also a part of this determinate landscape. And it happens to be a specific type of this determinate landscape. The first type is a positional or structural term, and the second is a relational comparative term. Smallness, smaller and larger, greater, lesser, more, fewer, earlier or later, these are our comparative terms. Now, smallness itself is an identity, and so therefore it participates in the expression of the one, that is, oneness and being. It is something that is, and it is one thing. Smallness, though, much like the one, and all other, well, maybe I shouldn't say all other, but at least in terms of the comparative terms, what we have is their existence when two things approximate. And so it's our sort of third relational term. It's the term that facilitates relation, I think. It gives it a general it gives context, I suppose, if we can use a term like that. So when Parmenides says, so smallness could not be in the one as a whole, but if in fact it is in the one, it would be in a part. So what is the reason that it cannot be in the one as a whole? Well, there's one potential reason is that if the smallness or smallness was in the one as a whole, it would be identical to the whole of the one, and so it would sort of replace the one's coherence and expression with the expression of that relational term of smallness. And it seems like what we're battling with here is not necessarily a confusion, but a placement of these fundamental terms. I think you can do a placement of any sort of thing, actually. It could be a property, it could be a quality, whatever. But smallness and these other determinate relational comparative terms are an interesting exercise to go through. Now we have an orientation. We have a particular way in which we see smallness in relation to the one. But it's almost an implied definition by the way that I speak of it. And so what I'd like to do is to try to make it a little bit more concrete and direct. So on one hand, if we were to say that smallness is a part of the one, there's a way in which we would be correct, and there's a way in which we would be incorrect. The way in which we would be correct is that insofar as smallness is inside of the one as a part, we recognize that from a expressive or purposeful standpoint, in order for smallness to be expressed, it must be planted within the substrate of the one, which includes oneness and being. And so if we say if it's planted within the substrate of oneness and being, well, perhaps it's a part of the one. But it's not a part of the one in the way that oneness and being is. So how do we consolidate these two seemingly incompatible, maybe inconsistent ideas? Because on one hand, it seems like the relationship to these determinate terms and the one is more sophisticated than what I'm leading myself to believe. Insofar as I struggle by reason to maintain the consistency of the identity of the one and navigate its relationships to other terms that have features and expressions that are almost similar to the one, in a way. Similar in the sense that they participate at this level, at the determinate level. But the one is seemingly most fundamental, at least for now. Our conception of it is that way, because the ground of all things is being, and the being that's united into some unified, coherent whole. If being was just incoherence, we would have, first of all, the intellect and the examination of such a thing from within that system would be impossible. But examining the hypothetical, it's almost like grabbing onto something, and then as soon as it is grasped, it leaves. It goes somewhere else. And this sort of reminds me of some things in physics that I've heard. I'm not a scientist by any means. My mind is unable to, or at least it hasn't been exposed to that type of material, nor is it a strong mathematical operator, but nonetheless, the sentiments of bizarre circumstances in which there's a grasping, a desire to grasp, but then as soon as something is attempted to be grasped, it's unable to be had. But its effects are observed in other ways. This is something that, in our case here, I don't think needs to be. Much earlier, we were describing the influence of the queen, the influence of non-being or of difference. And this influence is a subtle one, especially if one continually tries to break down difference into something more fundamental. At a certain point, its expression and its interaction with things is the way that we understand it. And perhaps I'm being contradictory here from what I just said about physics. I'm not sure. But nonetheless, we ought not to get stuck here. So again, this marriage between a fundamental determinate relational concept like smallness, and the one. So I think we've run into another static image problem, where the one static image by reason is maintained because we are maintaining the identity of the one. The other image is a dynamic image. It's an image in which the underlying assumption is that there is an identity of the one. The coherence of oneness in being allows for a particular type of expression. So we have this expression taking place. What we have now is not just a hypothetical circle with some boundary that is labeled the one. What we have is a field of potential by which we label that thing the one because of the coherence of that oneness in being. The possibility exists. And when smallness comes into being, it comes into being because it's afforded by the one. It's made possible by it. Now, do we say that that smallness is inside of the one? Kind of. I don't know. It depends on our perspective. It's not inside of the mechanics of that expression, the bridge of coherence of the one. And again, I've made that point just a moment ago, but it's worth doing again. Okay, so we have this new image, more of a dynamic image. And we have all of these relational terms that are coming into the fray. So to answer Parmenides' statement, would we say that it's a part? We say yes, it's a part in a way. But again, says Parmenides, not in all the part. Otherwise, it will do exactly the same thing as it did in relation to the whole. It will be equal to or larger than whatever part it is in. So here we're taking a very rational perspective about the nature of the small. And in order to tackle the relationship that smallness has to the one, we're taking small by its nature. We're saying because of the nature of the small, we can't be having it larger than something else. Therefore, smallness will never be in any being, since it occurs neither in a part nor in a whole. Nor will anything be small except for smallness itself. It seems not, says Aristotle. Now, what do we make of this? Smallness will never be in any being. Oh, we would say by our definition that it would exist on the periphery or on the margins. And in the particular context that we talked about it would exist within the one, but in the field of the one, not within the identity of the one. So largeness won't be in the one either, for if it were, something else, apart from largeness itself, would be larger than something, namely, that which the largeness is in. And that too, although there is for it no small thing which it must exceed, if in fact it is large. But this is impossible, since smallness is nowhere in anything. True, says Aristotle. So when Parmenides says, so largeness won't be in the one either, for if it were, something else apart from largeness itself would be larger than something, namely, that which the largeness is in. So in this case it would be the one, would be larger than largeness. But that wouldn't really make any sense. And again, much like smallness, largeness is a term of comparison, of related comparison. And so largeness would exist at the periphery of the one if the one is approximating something else. Now, when we talk about the execution or exercise of the one's expression, much like smallness, we have largeness that is sort of a seed that is planted there. Its own expression is facilitated by being and being one. And so when it is expressed, when it is utilized, it is when two things come into contact. Where we still have to go, I think, is establishing this thingness. It's such a bizarre landscape, I think. As even the positional or structural terms can be kind of difficult to hammer down. And these relational or comparative terms also, it just seems a bit fluid. Which is interesting that in the modern era, we speak of something like a gender. This is sort of calming down now, but the social contagion for a while was the confusion about gender. And I see even so the precursor to this is the sort of the feminism that expressed a type of fluidity of identity as it relates to the female gender role in society. And this is another type of social contagion that I think has done harm to the basic building blocks of the human society, which is the family. Now, my opinion on these sorts of things, it doesn't matter as much, but it's still, I think, remains an interesting reflection on how one's perception of identity can alter by second-order effects the structure and the nature of relating. And in fact, one's own view of the internal identity or the cultural view of one identity can actually affect an identity at a larger scale, like the collective identity or the coherence of a cultural order or cultural customs. And so these types of identity relations are way beyond where we are now. We're at very grassroots, fundamental, elementary, basic level. Parmenides continues in that paragraph. Although there is for it no small thing which it must exceed, in that example that we gave a moment ago, if in fact it is large. But this is impossible, since smallness is nowhere in anything. So we have this idea of competing, or the hypothetical of competing relational determinants. And it's not a matter of competition between these two. It's a matter of identification, saying that this thing is larger than that thing. It's not the subjection of the large to some more principled or fundamental identity. It's a facilitation of a more fundamental principled identity that allows the expression of these determinate expressions to come about. So today is the day following that last little bit of recording, and I've been debating on how to start this, and I didn't come up with a clear answer. You know, it's a funny thing, our experience, the human experience. It is, in large part, what we make of it. If we want to see beautiful things, if we want to experience beautiful things, we can do so. Through a bit of navigation, we can do so, but ultimately we can do so. And if we wish to be passive and let life roll by us, we can also do that. And I think about my working life. I think about the experiences that I have day to day. And I think about this moment now, this sort of somber reflection back on it. Number one, on its sweetness, but then also on those moments for which I know that I must capitalize to a greater degree to experience that beauty. But then thirdly, also a reflection on how this exercise, this practice, has helped me, I think, to see deeper into my own experience and also the experience of others. I'm by no means perfect at it, and perhaps by an outside observer or viewer I may be average. But nonetheless, it has helped me experience life to a greater fullness and richness. And it's for this that I'm thankful for. And I think about where we have been in this podcast so far, this series, part number 15. By the end of this, we're going to be 30 hours into this of verbal recording and more, just based on thought and reflection. And thinking back on it, there's a lot of time that has gone into this. I think that I ought not to forget what the purpose of this is. An intellectual exercise, sure, but also an exercise by which I come to understand things about myself and reality that I perhaps did not understand before. And while there are a great many things that might seem distant and abstract from my own experience, what we are building is a way of relating to experience itself. And some of the minutiae may draw the mind away from that ultimate goal. We should not get distracted and every once in a while come back to check in with where we are and where we have been. Parmenides says, "But largeness itself is not greater than anything other than smallness itself." nor is smallness less than anything other than largeness itself. So while this may be a basic statement, and it's easily understood to be the case that we may be in agreement with this, Aristotle says no, they aren't. Agreeing with what Parmenides had to say here. But I think on one potential interesting avenue for thought here is that this largeness and smallness business is we're in this fundamental territory of these determinate relational terms that are outlining these sort of primordial identities. The interaction among these terms, the identity of the term itself, I think is useful in our generating this picture or this image. Why is it useful? Smallness and largeness, as has been said, they are relational terms. Their interaction together gives boundary, which I think is interesting. It's interesting on one hand because smallness and largeness as relational terms give an idea of how two different identities relate to each other. But as these two terms relate to each other, they give us a boundary. They give us sort of the concept itself of largeness and smallness. It's sort of an expression, much like the one expresses oneness in being. The coherence of that resulting in the possibility of all things that are. Now, exactly where do we place this boundary? Well, again, it's a fundamental term, so it's a bit close to the eyes, so to speak. And when I say close to the eyes, I mean imagining a scenario in which we move maybe our hand very close to our eyes. At a certain point, it becomes kind of difficult to understand exactly what we're looking at. Maybe a better example would be looking through a contact lens or looking through a pair of glasses. Once the glasses are over the eyes, what we see is a type of clarity. Or in the case of the former, even though it's not the best analogy, we can't really appreciate the hand for what it is because it fills our environment. And much like this, the one and smallness and largeness, they have this effect as they relate to each other. So what exists now is the possibility of having something be larger than something else, or something be smaller than something else. And this is relevant when we talk about an identity, something that is identified. So the others, says Parmenides, aren't greater than the one, nor are they less, because they have neither largeness nor smallness. So this is an interesting term here. So he's speaking of the others. the others being those things that are, by the expression of oneness in being, by the expression of the one, but not the one, because the one is an independent identity. The reason that they aren't greater or less is because they have neither largeness nor smallness. And this is true. When we think about the identity of largeness and smallness, we have a boundary. It's not as though the boundary is participating in something. It's creating the field by which something then plays. But also the individual actions, the expressions, become clear on the approach, on the approximation. Two identities are called into observation. We have largeness and smallness not within them, but about them, sort of around them in a certain way, between them. There's a certain... language is a funny thing. When I think about relation, and I think about part of the term, for whatever reason I think about part of it. I think about the REL, or relatio, so put a Latin twist on it. I think about a unique experience, a beautiful experience, in which, while the possibilities and the principles for something to be exist, what we find in their expression is, at least in part, through their relation. And this sort of relatio is unique because it's not completely self-absorbed by one particular identity. It requires the communication. It requires this sort of networking effect between identities. And that, I think, I find beautiful. Nor do these two, says Parmenides, themselves, largeness and smallness, have in relation to the one their power of exceeding and being exceeded. This is another interesting concept, but it reinforces where we've already been. That the power is sort of the field, it's the landscape. It's not necessarily that largeness and smallness is in competition with the one. They are in ontological relation to the one. Their existence is dependent on the expression of the one. And the sort of uniqueness of identity is, or the unfolding of identity, maybe I should say, is dependent on the farther expressing of limitation and orientation of types, of orders, as we've been discussing, of determinations. They have it, rather, in relation to each other. Another beautiful statement, I think, by Parmenides. Nor could the one, in its turn, be greater or less than these two, or the others, since it has neither largest nor smallness. So again, I think this reinforces the idea of where we are in the identity landscape. That we're in a place quite fundamental, that the one itself as an identity is so foundational, so structural, that many even of the determinate expressions do not articulate with it in a way that it depends on which way we choose to conceptualize it, but there's a particular order. Maybe it's above or below, I'm not really sure, but at least when we move into that more and more of a determinate landscape, and we're adding these relational terms and structural terms, it's quite clear that the fields that emerge and that eventually interact together, I think, begin to form like these sparks of greater, or maybe not greater, but in some sense like a progressive type of manifestation of identity and of relationality. So one field, let's say one layer, would be the layer of the one. The next one would be maybe an intermixing, for the lack of a better conceptual framework, an intermixing of different types of fields. So we have the boundary that is created by largeness and smallness. We have the boundary that is created by the inside and the outside. I want to think if there's anything more that we have in terms of our terms here. Earlier and later would be another one, an interesting one of time. More and fewer, another interesting one. Inside-outside probably would be more of a structural predicate. But nonetheless, we're speaking about these fields and how the opposites create the fields by their relation to each other. But then, as the identities are sort of as they emerge through these distinctions, or determinants, I should say, then what we have is a greater sense of this coherence, a greater sense of what a particular identity is. nor could the one, in its turn, be greater or less than these two, or others, since it has neither largeness nor smallness. Its relationship to the one, again, is the coherence of oneness and being. We always have to keep that in mind. So if the one is neither greater nor less than the others, it must neither exceed them nor be exceeded by them, necessarily, says Aristotle. Now, it is quite necessary for something that neither exceeds nor is exceeded be equally matched. And if equally matched, equal. No doubt, says Aristotle. So let's read that again. Now it is quite necessary that something that neither exceeds nor is exceeded. So what does it mean to exceed or be exceeded? Again, it seems to depend on a particular type of relevance. We can think about it in terms of exceeding a boundary, like a length. We can think about it exceeding its action, or exceeding something's purpose. Or maybe that's not a good way to go about it. It's funny, moreness is one of these comparative predicates. When I think exceeding, I think of that sort of quality. Maybe I should pose the question, where are we right now? What exactly are we exceeding? I mentioned that it's a comparative term, okay, then it sort of implies two identities. There's one thing that we are comparing it to. It is quite necessary that something that neither exceeds nor is exceeded be equally matched. So if we say something is exceeded, then I think about an image of the cognitive light cone overlap, in which there might be shared qualities, there might be shared determinations, but within the sharing, we can't distinguish, we can't determine, which is a bit ironic. We can have determinate features without having a coherent observation of an identity. I think it's certainly possible. The determinates themselves would be identities in that case. They would still, the things that we are seeing, the there-ness would be those things. But as they congregate, as they move together, we assume that there is some boundary. There's some boundary by which we can identify something. We say that there is a there that is put together by other things that are there. And some of these things that are there are these determinate features that are completely relational. Some of them are sort of more spatial, as we've mentioned. And as they're expressed, we begin to see something of, and what I'm going to call an independent identity. When I say independent identity, I mean something that can be seen, observed. I want to use the word instantiation. I'm not sure if that's correct to use it here, but it is, in the sense, coming to be from parts. It is, in essence, is being formed. A pillar or a central column of the light cone is being established for something that perhaps wasn't otherwise there. And this thing, as it emerges, it has sort of this centrality to it, for which the overlap is no longer a confusing feature. The primary feature, when one stumbles across the pillar, is the identity itself, which is sort of shaped by all of these terms that we've been speaking about. And so when we think about something exceeding this, in my mind, perhaps this will change. Maybe it's not a good image, maybe it is a good image, I don't know, but just experimentally thinking here, when we move into this zone of overlap, when the light begins to fade, but it's not nothing, it's just lacking of a more fertile, determinate landscape, such that stable identities, or maybe that's redundant, stability itself can find its home there, to be loved and to be nourished and to be grown. And so when we see something that is beyond these boundaries, or when we reflect on the potential for exceeding this, it is quite necessary that something that neither exceeds nor is exceeded be equally matched. We're thinking about a sort of an infinity of sorts, and I have to wonder about this thing that cannot be exceeded. If we're talking about this, then perhaps we're talking about the layer of determinate features and the one that sort of directly, harmoniously underlies it. It is quite necessary that something that neither exceeds nor is exceeded be equally matched, and if equally matched, equal. So I'd say that the one's expression cannot be exceeded, because there can't be something that is and also be one without being unified in that way. Furthermore, Parmenides says, the one would also itself be so in relation to itself, having neither largeness nor smallness in itself, it would neither be exceeded by nor exceed itself, but, being equally matched, would be equal to itself. And this is something that I agree with, but it's not really a matter of agreeing, of course. This is exercise territory, this exercise landscape. And when I was reading this, I thought about the sophist. I also think about the unfortunate reality of my limited memory. And all that work that was put into the sophist, there are things that I have taken from it, there are things that I've forgotten. But there is one thing in particular that sticks out to me, and it's the concentration on the relationship between the king and the queen. The king being and the queen being non-being, or difference, sort of having these opposites. And the rejection of the statement, all things are one. And so far, I think we've found ourselves in a place where we can do quite a lot with language and make our way through rationally a territory in one expression, but if we orient it and give it a slightly different perspective, the words themselves don't quite line up as they did in a different perspective, and we just can't use the language in that way anymore. And so this is one of the difficulties, I think, that from a philosophical standpoint I have had with thinking about a coherent philosophical or maybe ontological structure of reality. And perhaps I shouldn't really have a strict one, rather be satisfied with the exercises that go on in this space. And these exercises ultimately do shape the mind and shape the orientation in a way that is productive, but it's not determinant in a way that would limit farther exploration or the benefits of the exercise. And that's not to say that I don't believe in a structure, of course. It's rather just leaving room to tolerate difference within my own thinking. And if difference, I suppose, is to be tolerated throughout all things that are, even the one itself, then it seems perfectly reasonable to follow this principle all the way through. So as we were considering this, I'm glad Parmenides went to this place, because we're thinking about the one in relation to itself. So it gives us a picture of how to view the one, and there is this almost limitless or expanse type of expression as it relates to it. It's almost like, I wish I had the Bible here in front of me. But with the internet, things are not very far away. So let's do a little bit of reading in Genesis, because there's an idea here that I think is fundamental. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault, and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. And he called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. And God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. We go down to verse 14, and God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let there be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater to govern the day and the lesser to govern the night. Also made stars. If we go to the King James Version, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And thus God made the firmament, and divided the waters, and were under the firmament from the waters, which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. From the Orthodox Jewish Bible, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And God was hovering upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And evening and morning were day one, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse, or a dome, or a firmament, in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the mayim from the mayim," or the waters from the waters. So, while there is not a direct connection yet for where we are here, I think there are some interesting parallels. Perhaps not necessarily in the division. I think we can draw more parallels of the division in terms of non-being, or the queen's action, or of just difference in general as it relates to the propagation of identity and of being. When we think about the expanse, though, we're thinking about something that perhaps is not exceeded. This is heaven. And if heaven is to be this expanse, though its action serves to divide the waters and not necessarily to give the ground for the waters themselves. The giving of the ground for the waters is sort of God's place, it would seem. The principle of the expanse that is sort of married to this difference, I think, is interesting. Right now we're talking about the principle of the expanse being married to the one, which is the expression of oneness and being. Now, in our Parmenidean or Platonic world, this the one I like to say, or I like to think, that it precedes, in a way, maybe there's more elegant language to be used there, but precedes smallness, largeness. Because if we consider these determinate features, specifically of the family of relational comparative features, when we take the one and we mirror it on itself, we do not find the expression of largeness and smallness. But I suppose I have to ask the question, well, would it be this way for all things? And I think to a degree it would be accurate to say that. But even if we compare the one to other things, I don't think it would add up in this way, that there would be a largeness and smallness by a comparative relation. Again, Parmenides says, furthermore, the one would also itself be in relation to itself, having neither largeness nor smallness in itself. It would neither be exceeded by nor exceed itself, but being equally matched, would be equal to itself. Of course, says Aristotle. Therefore, the one would be equal to itself and the others. Apparently. Now, where is this equivalence? We can see, I think, most easily, that it is equivalent to itself. But how can we say that the one is equivalent to this water bottle? It would seem that there are plenty of ways by which we could say that the one is not the same as the water bottle. But as we trace the water bottle back by its principles, back through the way it came to be, instantiated, came to be in general, we do find the bedrock of the one. We do find the expression of oneness in being in its fundamental structure. It has come to be instantiated or manifest in the way that it is because of the layering of determinations and the action of difference, differentiating these into kinds and layering properties on top of that to give it characteristics. Or rather, give it qualities that give it characteristics, and then eventually these properties by which it comes to be here and now. So is it the same as the one? Yes. Is it the same as the one? No. The struggle continues. But I don't think it's necessarily something that needs to be solved. The vision, I think, is sufficient to understand. We have a good, I think, foundation. This sort of orientation that we've been hitting at, I think, is good. It makes sense. It's not necessary for us to solve that type of question, though we can continue to explore it because it's going to be useful in our progression. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Today happens to be a Sunday evening, and I'm not sure if it's perceivable, but it's raining quite heavily outside. It happens to be mid-March. Today was a warmer day. It happens to be 30 to some degrees outside now. As the night progresses, it's probably going to turn below freezing. And once it's below freezing, we'll probably get some snow. And we have 1 or 2 more days that are going to be cold, and then it's going to warm back up again into the 40s and 50s. Now, I'd like to spend some time talking about something that I may have or may not have glossed over. It's this last sentence when Parmenides says, therefore the one would be equal to itself and the others. Now the equal to itself, I understand. The equal to the others, I'm remembering now. I think we did go over this, but nonetheless, I think it's going to be important to go over again. So equal to the others. Again, I think there's a perspectival aspect to this, in the sense that it is equal to the others in that the identity of the one can be appreciated within the sort of base layer, bedrock, of all identity. Oneness and being are coherent in any identity. And so there's an equivalence there. In terms of an absolute equivalence, I have to ask myself the question, well, if something so foundational as is necessary to produce variability that the one itself doesn't possess, but is capable of turning into, let's say, by the angular expression of being, oneness and being layered by determinate features and subsequent properties, characteristics, or qualities, characteristics, then properties. There's this sort of line through by which we can see the influence of the one, but the identity of the one itself is that bedrock base layer. And so on one hand, again, we can say that there is this equivalence throughout, but also a degree of difference because of this layering of information. And he continues, he says, and yet, since it is in itself, it would be also around itself, on the outside, and as container it would be greater than itself. But as contained it would be less. So, I remember now, I think we were sort of at this point last time. It's interesting to me that Parmenides has taken a logical step into a determinate, more of a determinate landscape. He's moving forward in the sense of layering this cake. We've established coherence between oneness and being. Great, now we have this playground by which we can build. And he says, well, he makes the observation, since it is in itself, it would also be around itself if it is going to be equivalent to other things. And so we have this moving into the first determinate layer, one of the first determinate layers. And this is the in some sense it's a positional term, inside, outside. The outside, of course, is a determinate feature that suggests that there is a that, whereas the one is this, what is outside is that. Now, if we say that that on the outside of the one is also the one, then there has to be a degree of difference by which we would say that it is that. Because if it is an equivalent, based on our sort of mirrored definition, rather than an equivalence by proximity, then the one must have added features to it that makes it different from the one. Now I want to pause for a moment and think on the nature of this, because as soon as a determinate feature is added to the identity of the one, the question is, does it cease being one? I think the answer is no, but it does cease to be the pure identity of the one. It is not just the coherence of oneness and being. It is the coherence of oneness and being, and it is that, which at that layer, it seems to be bit bizarre. It doesn't really make too much sense. Really, the only determinate feature is that it is other than. There's relational difference. Otherness, and of course we have an image in our mind of the outside. And when we speak about the outside, we speak about boundary. We speak about the boundary as it pertains to an identity. There is a threshold by which, once it is crossed, we are entering into a different fundamental territory, fundamental landscape, this and that. Where that, even in this sort of primordial case, is not so well defined. It's not descriptive, of course. But at least we can say that it is that. There is something there. It is otherness. And if we had to give it a bookmark or a placeholder, this otherness we can sort of, in our minds, imagine like it's any sort of solid material object separating two things, or it could just be a sort of a nondescript, amorphous thing that has some boundary around it that we say, okay, this is this thing, just for conceptual purposes only. But of course, in logic landscape, this is not really required. We could just say that otherness is the thing that occupies that territory, or that occupies the outside is the thing that occupies that territory. And when we say the outside, I think an important distinction is that we should say that the outside is not the outside of the coherence of oneness and being. The coherence of oneness and being is throughout the whole. Because it's the environment by which something can come to be and can be one. But the specific place for which we understand oneness and being to come together as parts of a whole in an identity through that bridge of coherence that we mentioned, then we say that that is the one. That relationship between those two things are the one. And yet, since it is in itself, it would be also around itself on the outside. And as container, it would be greater than itself. But as contained, it would be less. And thus, the one would be greater and less than itself. Yes, it would be. So let's try and dig into this a little bit more. Now, these comparative terms, these comparative relational terms, we find ourselves again in what I'm going to be calling perspective landscape, or the Vervaekean perspectival landscape. Because the conditions by which something being in itself and then the thing itself being larger than the thing that is within it is possible only if we can consider the question in my mind becomes, are we considering partiality? Are we considering a partial essence? For the way in which the one is inside of itself is similar to the way in which the one is inside of me. Because I am one thing. There are many parts to me, but I am an identity. The thing that is speaking is an identity. It is a coherent oneness, coherent relation between oneness and being, and yet I'm not the one, and yet the one is in me. I suppose I could say, well, that I am within myself. And I think it would be accurate to say that insofar as the identity has some boundary, and the boundary contains something. And I think there might be an interesting relationship here to explore between what the identity is and what the boundary is, what the relationship of the boundary is to the identity. We can also say what the relationship of the periphery is to the center. This is quite a proverbial discussion that we're getting into. A lot of this language is found there. We really haven't touched much on this aspect of the determinate. I know that I've mentioned it, but not perhaps in detail. So let's begin to think about it then. So the center of something versus the periphery. We'll have to define this in a way that makes sense. The center of the one, in my mind I've been saying that it is the bridge of coherence of oneness and being. Now, in my mind I imagine this sort of cobblestone bridge. It's arched, it connects two things together. Two planes together. In this case, it's two principles it connects together. Now, the material manifestation in my mind is not necessarily the center, let's say. The center is the coherence of those two principles together. Of course, it's the bridge, which is the symbol. But by their interaction, their proximity, there produces an affordance, or what I've called a coherence, such that something that is coherent allows for something else to be on top of it, or to be added, or to be manipulated, maybe expressed is probably the best word to use here. And so the center has to do with something fundamental. It has to do with the purpose and I think maybe direction of something. Because when we say the coherence of oneness and being, the expression of that thing is the thing that, well, it matters to me. But the expression of that thing is, I think, approaching the base layer of what it is to say the identity of the one. And moreover from that, we've been using this language, light cone language, by which there is a way in which we describe, like any sort of lamp at night. It's useful that it's at night now. I could look outside and I could look in my apartment here and I could see I've got two different lamps that are lit up. I've got a light on a little bit farther, illuminating the staircase. Creates a nice ambient environment, but the ambience of the environment is not necessary to the point that we're discussing now, but a general nice observation. The point is that given that it's dark outside, there's very little light that's coming in from the outside, the concentration of light is at these lampposts and the light bulbs. And this creates a type of center around which we have the moving out or the expression of what originated at the center. And if it is to be the case that the thing that is producing the light in the one is the coherence of oneness and being, such that the stability of those two principles together facilitates, because the light facilitates my vision, of course. It allows me to see, just like the one allows other identities to be built on top of it, using the coherence between those two principles. And so the center, I think, we have found our definition. It is an expression of purpose. The light bulb's expression of its purpose is to emit light. The purpose of the one is to emit the coherence between oneness and being, and the solidity of that relationship, the dependable solidity of that relationship. So the next thing to talk about is the periphery. The question is, as we move away from the center, are we getting less and less of the essence, less and less of the purposeful thing? If we go back to our light analogy, there's a point at which the light from my lamp doesn't penetrate as strongly into my kitchen, which is farther off in the distance. It penetrates strongly where I am now, where the book and the computer and the microphone are, the front room in general. But the more peripheral spaces it doesn't capture as well. Now I have to wonder this type of relationship within an identity, because if we are to say that the identity of the apartment is the expression of space, maybe there are different ways to describe it, I don't know, but just for now, it's the expression of space, the expression of home, my home environment. Then it is to say that within the identity, there is a degree by which the expression takes place. And as we move away, at least in physical space where I am now, the penetration of that light cone is less. Now, I think this would scale. I think it's obvious that it scales to the outside dynamic, in the sense that, this is where I'll have to go next, but in the sense that if we take a particular identity, that light cone is going to share its boundary with something else. And perhaps it's going to share more than just that. Perhaps there are qualities that exist within that close environment around the expression of the thing, expression of the identity, that other identities sort of share in some of that language, that sort of ontological grammar, let's say, or determinate grammar, or descriptive grammar, depending on the layer that we're speaking of. But as it relates to the periphery within the identity, if we are going to be thinking in these spatial terms, why would it be necessary for the strong point, or the center of the light cone, to sort of fade to the point of its boundary? Now, identity in this description, I don't think it's going to have the type of strong relationship as a boundary like a building, or a boundary like a map would have. I mean, even in the case of the map, we think in terms of the map, but we experience something that is entirely different. But the map is still sufficient for our understanding of separation of countries and of principalities in general. So the map is still a useful tool, much like our sort of strict spatial representation is a useful tool. But I think in reality it's probably much more fluid, dynamic. It's not fluid and dynamic to the point where the identity can't hold or doesn't exist. Now, of course, there are cases in which identities transform and change, in that case, of course, we would undergo a type of experience that would fundamentally alter the way in which the light cone is being expressed. But when we're talking about these fundamental terms, the principles, these don't really change. They change perhaps by their orientation, and the way they're expressed will appear different because of the layering of information, but the principles themselves, the foundations, remain steady and constant. But going back to this expression of light cone identity, not necessarily formation, but identity expression, identity maintenance. Identity expression is probably the best way to go about it, because this term expression is one of our fundamental ways by which we are attempting to describe the ways in which for the lack of a better term, I'm hoping I'm using this correctly, but essence is used to essence is used to describe the fundamental expression of the underlying principle of the identity. How, when this landscape of identity shifts and then merges or comes into contact with some other identity. Now, in terms of the landscape and the difference between the map at one level and the ground at another level, in some sense we can have distinctions at multiple levels, or at multiple layers. The distinction that the map layer rests on, at least in terms of the geography, now the topology, I believe I'm using that word correctly, as it relates to the specific structural features of land, would be a different type of map than the one I'm thinking about now. I'm thinking about the one that separates principalities. This layer of map is something that is, as we've described before, it's information layered on top of a more fundamental layer. And the more fundamental layer is the way that the landscape is physically oriented. And there's nothing about the landscape itself that would give an indication to the identity of the landscape that a nation exists there. It's something of an added input, an added identity on top of what is already there. This goes more towards our part and whole dynamic, where the parts can be individual expressions of the one, and the whole can be an expression of the one. Now, part of the difficulty is stripping away some of the complexity and then just having in mind one identity. And still, I don't think that we've touched on or accurately addressed this internal center and periphery distinction. So a moment ago, the issue was dealing with the layers of, not necessarily information, but the layers of observation by which we can, it is layers of information, but it's also the sort of subject interface by which we understand a particular identity. And I think that the map, geographical, and then the map, topological, and then the sort of physical experience being in that physical place that the maps represent. I think these are all different aspects of identities, of experience, of observation. So there is a subjective component by which we have to sift through this a little bit. But as we move away from that, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, what I'm concerned with is sort of being present at the place. So an obvious boundary that we would see on a topological map would be when dry land meets the ocean. And we can make it even easier and to say it's a cliff face. It's very obvious, observationally, that there is this sort of boundary there. There are other boundaries that are not this way, so we ought not to restrict ourselves, but as we ease into talking about this peripheral situation, I think it's useful to have these two images in mind. Okay, so as we are considering being present as the light sort of dissipates away from us, we have this centerpiece of identity. The question remains, what is this phenomenon of dissipation? So I think there's another important thing to recognize here. We're moving away from the perspectival. We're still in that landscape, but we're adding on phenomenological experience. At least that's what I'm calling it. And this is the dimming effect, the phenomena of the dim, or of the reduction. And so I have to ask myself the question, well, what is being reduced? Is it the identity itself? Is it the concentration of the identity? Is it the expression of the identity? If we say, for the sake of argument, that the center point of this thing, the light cone, is expressing the same intensity of light, it's more about, in this case, it's more than about the experience of, well, how far does that light go into the periphery? What things along that landscape by which its expression affects, by what degree are they influenced by this thing? And how does it change based on the identities that are more proximate to it versus those identities that are farther away from it? And at least from an observational standpoint, the identities that are closer to this thing are more affected by the expression of that thing than the things that are farther away. They're still affected by its expression, but to a less degree. So I think then the question becomes, well, what is this effect? It's a relational effect. It's sort of the intensity of relation. If I think about myself as an individual and having relations with many different people, there are different relationships that I have. Some are professional, some are personal, some are more like acquaintances, some are strong friendships. And among these, I can see this image playing out in the more peripheral relationships where the effect of my expression, my identity, is not as strong as somebody who knows me well, like my friends whose house I just came back from not long ago. So I think here we have a definition of what the periphery is, both internally and externally. It is the degree to which identities in relation to the identity in question are affected by its expression. And there's much to be said about all of the ways in which that can happen. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with part 16 of Parmenides.